Well, hey there. Welcome back to the Terry Cole Show. I'm your host, Terry Cole, and we're continuing this unique series where I share some of my favorite podcast episodes where I've been on the other side of the mic. So this gives me an opportunity to share different parts of my life and my work experience with you than I would if I were the one asking the question. So in today's episode, I'm excited to revisit a really enlightening conversation that I had with one of my very smart pals, John Miles, on his Passion Struck podcast. So huge shout out to John for this deeply enriching dialogue, and thank you for letting us feature it here. John is a remarkable host, and he dives into topics that truly matter, and our discussion was absolutely no exception. His insightful questions and the depth of our discussion brought to light many personal stories and intimate details that I don't often get to share. It was a conversation filled with moments of vulnerability and strength, and a shared passion for helping others navigate the complexities of life with greater ease and understanding. And in celebration of John Miles and his impactful work, I want to highlight his book, Passion Struck, a must-read for anyone looking to delve deeper into the themes that we discussed in this interview. It's an insightful exploration that I highly recommend. So without further ado, let's dive into this special episode. I hope that you enjoy these fresh perspectives and the insights shared as much as I did. Here's my conversation with John Miles on Passion Struck. Enjoy.
Coming up next on Passion Struck.
Human beings, we have a natural fear of change. And I always say that fear of success and fear of failure are two sides of the same coin, but the coin is fear of change. So you have to really be uncomfortable to want to make a change and to be willing to do all the things that are required to change your life. But on the other side of it, of course, is the life you're meant to live, right? Is the life of satisfaction, the life of service, the life of your greatest good. But it's really hard when you're anticipating or contemplating that change to see the other side. All we see is all the stuff we're sort of giving up or what we might lose in making this change. And it's like you have to use your imagination to think about what could be on the other side of that power pivot.
Welcome to Passion Struck. Hi, I'm your host, John R. Miles, and on the show, we decipher the secrets, tips, and guidance of the world's most inspiring people and turn their wisdom into practical advice for you and those around you. Our mission is to help you unlock the power of intentionality so that you can become the best version of yourself. Let's go out there and become Passion Struck. I am so honored and ecstatic to have the one and only Terry Cole on the Passion Struck today. Welcome, Terry.
Well, thanks for having me, John.
I'm going to start out with this question. Last year, you and I both interviewed Dr. Lisa Hellerman, who I understand is a long-term friend of yours. And like you, she was a top talent agent for celebrities like Ben Stiller and Vince Vaughn. But similar to you, she walked away from it all to become a psychotherapist. And I wanted to ask, how did you find yourself on your own, as she calls it, soul journey to leaving the money and prestige behind and quitting your job?
Well, there was a parallel process that was going on for my own therapeutic journey, which started when I was just 19. I stopped drinking when I was 21. So Elisa and I have that in common as well. And I think that what was happening in my career was I was very ambitious and I was always like a lover of life, like whatever I was in all the way. So when I got into entertainment, I was just climbing that entertainment Hollywood sort of ladder, thinking that if I get to this next place, I'm going to feel the way that I want to feel. If I sign this next huge supermodel, if I'm running an agency, then I'm going to feel the way I want to feel. Well, then I got to that point, and you know what? Still didn't feel the way I wanted to feel. And so I realized that I was looking for a feeling, but in the wrong place. And that it wasn't going to come from outside of me. It was going to have to come from inside of me. And at the same time, I was having all of this personal growth, evolution in my own life. And I became really interested in the mental health of my clients. So I got to a point in my career that there was just no denying that what I was most interested in was helping other people live mentally healthier lives like I was. I couldn't believe that how much I could change my own life, my own internal experience, my own external experience through therapy. I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is like the best kept secret. Are you kidding me? Because really, when you think about, or at least the way that I thought about coming into the world, like you're like, okay, we're dealt a hand, right? And then you play that hand to your very best ability. And what therapy made very clear for me was that if I didn't like the hand, not only could I say, I'm getting rid of this hand, I could be like, I'm creating an entirely new game. Like, I'm not just dealt a hand. Like, I realized through therapy that I could create a meaningful life on my own terms. And that required me to be honest with myself and say I was no longer passionate about making supermodels richer. I just prayed. I was like, God, there's got to be something better I could do with my one and only life. And there was. And I quit my job. I went to NYU. I literally applied to one grad program, one, because I only wanted to go to NYU. I'd been living in the city for many years. I was like, I'm not moving to Ohio to go to grad school. So I really hope I get in. And if not, something else will happen. And that's how I made the change.
Well, one of the things I really like to talk about on the show is intentional choices, because every day we don't even realize it, but we have the choice to self love or to self hate, to make a relationship better, to make it worse, how we want to allocate our time. Do we do it towards things where we're worshiping the idols of money, success, and other things, or do we do it to go deeper into building stronger human connections? And so, as I was researching you, I started to see, as you had described yourself, and I saw others describing you as the person I once was before. And I'm just going to read this because I found this in show notes describing an episode that you did from a while ago. But I want to read it because I think other people can relate to it. And it says, Terry was a type A overachiever with zero balance and no internal peace, driven by ambition, living on planes and serving as a business executive, confident advisor, surrogate parental figure, and bounding between nearly every role with every person imaginable. And I have to tell you, when I read that, it described who I was. And along that path, by the time that it reached its lowest point, I had become emotionally numb. I'm not sure how you felt at that point.
I was pretty bitter, actually. I was pretty resentful. That's what really inspired me to dig deeper in therapy. I didn't understand why I was feeling that way. I was overgiving, highly codependent, over functioning my ass off, like just over delivering, over all the things. It was like achievement and success was the thing that made me feel like I was worthy. I was as worthy as my last big deal. I was as worthy as my last whatever. And it was the resentment, generally, personality wise. I'm a pretty optimistic and pretty joyful, happy person. That is my actual personality. And through therapy, I realized I was blaming others for my lack of boundaries. I was blaming others for me not setting limits, right? But I was pissed at them. Like, how nervy is Betty to ask me? And then, of course, in real life, Betty's going to ask you to do all the things that Betty wants to ask you to do. It's not on Betty to set limits for Terry, right? It's on Terry to set limits for Terry. And so the empowerment that came with having those realizations and taking like a radical responsibility for myself, for my feelings, for my happiness, for my actions, for what I participated in, for what I didn't participate in, for what I tolerated, for what I didn't tolerate. Giving, really wanting to get into giving from a place of choice. And what you realize when you don't really have, what's the way to describe it? Unexamined life. You don't realize that you're being driven by compulsions, by an unconscious desire to avoid confrontation, emotional pain, rejection, all of these things. But I didn't know that. So it was a real wake-up call to look at, oh, wait, this is my side of the street. Like, I need to clean up my side of the street. I can keep blaming Betty or Bob or anybody, and yet it will only change when I'm willing to take radical responsibility for myself and my happiness.
Part of me is laughing because my mom's name is Betty. And I
Oh,
have to
poor Betty.
say that my parents, but especially my mom, was a stickler for expecting us to be high achievers and not settling. And I think that in some ways drove me to go down the path that I ended up following in many ways. And it's hard when your parents put these expectations on you of the person that they expect you to be to live up to them sometimes.
Yeah. Think about as kids, like we're indoctrinated into a system, right? A belief system, a way of being. And as little humans, we don't need an inner office memo to tell us how to get the approval of the adults in our life.
No, we start figuring it out in the subtle cues that they give us about what tends to bring smiles out of their faces or frowns. And so you start
Exactly.
reacting, and all of a sudden, before you know it, it's governing everything about your life, from the relationships you're in and not wanting them to let them down about it, and so many other things.
Yep.
So I can completely agree with you where you were, because I was holding down all these emotions from combat trauma and other things that had happened to me, and just not dealing with them until finally I reached a point where my emotional cup was so full, I finally had no other choice but to deal with it. And I recently did an interview with Harvard professor and author Arthur Brooks, and we were talking about this concept of life transition points, and he describes it through the use of the analogy of falling tides. Basically, when the tide starts falling, what ends up happening is the plankton and other things all get shaken up, and it's the time when the fish go to feed off the bait. Often in times in life, we also experience falling tides or transitions. Sometimes there are worse moments, but what happens is we don't put our line into the water to find them out. And I wanted to ask, we're all faced with these transition points in life and choosing what
Mhm.
direction to go. What do you think causes us so often to miss them?
Well, we're asleep. We get up and we burn through the day and we drop and we do it all over again. We numb ourselves. I talk about shadow addictions in the work that I do, which is a phrase that I coined because it's something that I saw so often, like emotion numbing behaviors that we do to continue to keep those feelings we don't want to feel at bay. So that may be drinking 3 glasses of wine a night. And I come from a background of like high functioning alcoholics where my father never missed a day of work. He retired when he was 51. He never got a DUI. That did not mean he was not dependent on alcohol, because he was. And so I think that these pivot moments, I call them sort of power pivots, if we decide to pivot, right? Like your entire life can change from a peak experience that you have. Literally, my entire life changed when I decided to not be a talent agent, when I decided to risk it all and go from a job making a ton of money to making literally no money, right? Having no money. And that was worth it for me because exactly what you're saying, your cup was so full, you had no choice. You had to do something different. That's what happened for me. And I think for a lot of people, when they hit this fork in the road, pain is the thing that drives us, right? As human beings, what is the biggest motivator? Pain. So the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of the unknown. And we make those moves if we feel the pain of staying the same. But with these shadow addictions or any kind of addiction, if you're numbing it, it's not propelling you in the way that it would if you weren't numbing it. So people will say, how do you think your life would be different if you didn't stop drinking at such a young age? And I always say, oh, I think I would have eventually stopped after 10 years of numbing the crap out of myself, and probably bad decisions and promises not kept and potential not realized. I imagine I probably would have stopped. But I'm really grateful that I took that pivot at that time in my life because I was so young. John, the question you asked was, why don't people pivot? Why don't, when we hit the fork in the road, why don't we take the pivot? And part of it is fear, like the devil as opposed to the devil you don't know. And so human beings, we have a natural fear of change. And I always say that fear of success and fear of failure are two sides of the same coin, but the coin is fear of change. So you have to really be uncomfortable to want to make a change and to be willing to do all the things that are required to change your life. But on the other side of it, of course, is the life you're meant to live, right? Is the life of satisfaction, the life of service, the life of your greatest good. But it's really hard when you're anticipating or contemplating that change to see the other side. All we see is all the stuff we're giving up or what we might lose in making this change. And it's like you have to use your imagination to think about what could be on the other side of that power pivot.
No, I can relate with you completely because at the time all this was happening, I was at what you would have thought was the pinnacle of my career, C-level in a Fortune 50 company, making
Yeah.
all the money I'd ever desired, had all the material possessions I could have wanted and everything else, and yet I was miserable inside. But when people ask me, how did you find your path to what you're doing today? It's such a radical change. I don't think that the idea comes up just out of the blue. For me, I kept having this feeling that what I was doing was not what I was set on the earth to do, which was to serve others. And I found myself completely misaligned with where my meaning was, where my hopes and aspirations were. And ultimately, I think the most difficult choice is the first one. And that is, as you described it, it is to take that step off the cliff into the abyss where you don't have a safety net. And I
Mhm.
think that's one thing that stops people from doing this is they put a safety net in place instead of just going for it, which I know if I would have done that, I would have ended up trying to balance both of them. But it really took me going full in, similar to you, having no income stream and just deciding I was going to take a chance on doing something different. And then, as Robin Sharma likes to say,
Mhm.
actions build up, and actions ultimately result when compounded into your zone of greatness that you achieve.
Yep.
I love what you're saying because people, I'm sure, are listening to us right now, and maybe they're not hitting a low point that we were at, and I hope they aren't. But regardless of where they're feeling stuck, the biggest action you have to take is the first one, and that is to change.
Yes. And to realize you are not that fragile. You're really not. Like you are so much more durable than you think. And if there's a part of you, if you're listening to this and there's a part of you that really feels like, wow, I'm not living my dharma or my purpose in life, I don't feel satisfied. I think part of it, John, is like we have to be the ones that prioritize our preferences, our limits, our deal breakers, right? This is how I talk about your boundaries. But what we must believe that what we think, how we feel, and what we want, it must matter to us more than what anyone else thinks, feels, and wants. And when I say that, people, especially women, are like, "Oh, that's so selfish, or you're a narcissist, or is it self-absorbed to feel that way?" Here's the thing: if we don't go through life that way, if we don't prioritize what we think, how we feel, what we want, what ends up happening is we end up putting that on other people. I want you to take care of me. I want you to make sure that my needs get met, but you can't because only I actually know what they are. I wanted to say something about what you were talking about with your own experience. Wayne Dyer, who I loved, we were talking before he passed, and he was talking about meaning, right? That in the beginning of our life, it's like a time of acquisition, like we're building. We want the family, we want the house, we want the stuff, as you were describing, we want the money, we want the whatever, the accolades. But then when you get into more of what he considered the afternoon of your life, this is when we really want meaning. We want to feel like us being on this planet Earth for this short period of time meant something, helped someone, did something. I'm never really into it when people are like, talk about legacy, you know what I mean? I don't know why, but maybe because I'm a therapist, it always just sounds like there's something narcissistic about, I want to leave my mark so you never forget me. You know what I mean? There's something weird about it to me, but that's just me. But what we're really talking about, I think from a healthier point of view, let's say if we were looking at legacy or if I was being less judgmental, it could be from the point of view of how did I love? Who did I serve? Did I have a positive ripple effect in the world? Kind of what you had said at the top, right? Are the choices I'm making the world a better place or a crappier place? Making my relationships more joyful, more harmonious, or more acrimonious, more constricted? Like, what am I doing? Oprah talks about taking responsibility for the energy that you leave in a room, the energy you bring into a room. And I feel this way on a macro level as well, that like we must take responsibility for how we interact with people in the world. And hopefully we want to leave the world better than it was when we got here.
I think that's a great lead into where I wanted to go. I want to go deeper into emotions. And the reason I want to do so is over this past year, as you probably saw, there were a lot of great books that were kind of dealing with painful emotions, whether it was Bittersweet from Susan Cain or The Power of Regret from Dan Pink or Big Feelings from Liz Fossilian. We've talked a lot about emotions on this show through those types of lenses, but we don't really discuss them and how do you deal with them in a healthy way. Why is it such a struggle for so many of us to do just that?
Well, I think our emotions are something that people don't teach us about. So we're left to the devices of our conscious and unconscious mind, our relational interactions, our what we modeled behavior, right? These are all the things that impact our emotional life. A lot of parents did not teach us to regulate our emotions because they did not know how to regulate their own emotions. So with children, as you're raising kids, part of the process, if you want a child to have a high emotional IQ, is that we are naturally teaching them, we are co-regulating with them because we're regulating ourselves. And that means that we understand our emotions, that when we're starting to feel activated, and I won't say triggered, again, I feel like that's another term that's just used to death and misused to death. So I just say activated, right? When you're starting to have big emotions, if you have been taught or learned, right? My parents didn't know how to verbally teach me, but I did have a mother who was very emotionally attuned to me. So how I felt mattered to my mother. And she taught me that how I feel should also matter to me. And so therefore, I grew up feeling valued and feeling seen and feeling understood. Even as a very small kid, I can remember my mother bending all the way down and being like, you don't want to wear that sweater? It's scratchy. You don't have to wear it. Or what are you saying? You're feeling what? Like she would really get in there and not just be how a lot of parents were. Kids should be seen and not heard. That was definitely not my experience with my mother in particular. So back to the question about emotions and why we don't know is that a lot of us were raised by parents who didn't know a feeling from a Frankfurter. So how are they teaching us how to manage our feelings? They would make you feel bad for having feelings. What about the statement, you quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about? Anyone who knows anything about emotions knows that doesn't work with children. You cannot make them stop crying. That will only make them cry more. But this desire to control emotions with kids and this sort of repulsion at hard emotions teaches us to stuff them. I grew up in a family where anger was a forbidden emotion. And so I learned to transmute my anger into sadness because sadness was an acceptable emotion. I was allowed to be upset, but I was not allowed to be angry. So, John, how do you think that impacted my 20s right, in my
In a big way.
relationships? Yes. Yes. And I continue. I mean, this is in my 50s. This is an ongoing evolution with managing emotions. But I feel like people think that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad, right? We've got all this hyper positivity out there also, especially on social media. People who are like, some horrible thing happens and everyone's like, well, that was God's plan, or everything happens for a reason, or it could have been worse, or all these very invalidating statements around emotions, because sometimes terrible things happen and they just suck. We don't need to be like silver lining detectives 24/7. You know what I mean? Like sometimes when someone is going through something crappy, what they really need to hear is you saying, how can I best support you? Or that's terrible. I'm so sorry that happened, but I'm here. If you want to talk, instead of being afraid of the emotion.
Looking back, I don't think there's ever been a parenting book written that truly prepares you to be a parent. That's
Mm.
for sure. But I found as I was raising my kids, and it was more my son, who's 5 years plus older than my daughter, who probably got the brunt of it, I was falling right into the same path that I had been raised, which it's so easy to do because for most of your life, that's what you experience. That's what you know of parenting. And it took me really a deliberate choice to make the decision that I was going to raise the kids differently and in a big way, give them a lot more autonomy over their choices because I just figured if you're going to make mistakes, I'd rather have you make them when they're young rather than as I was doing when I was an adult and trying to figure it out because I went from a very Roman Catholic parochial school all the way up through high school upbringing to then going into the military. And so I had been shaped by everyone, I like to say, but myself.
Yep.
And I think one of the most difficult things for me to identify and manage was emotional triggers. And I know that
Mhm.
this is something that you've really done some deep dives into. And so I was
Mhm.
hoping you could explain to the audience how do they identify and manage their emotional triggers?
Well, part of it is you have to start paying attention to your internal experience. You have to start, like I teach people how to do inventories. When was the last time you were triggered? What was the precipitating event? Start really looking. And when we look back, we can recall the last 5 times you felt hit by a bus of your own emotions, right? There's nothing wrong with feeling your emotions. Being triggered means that something is happening to you where it feels like it's overtaking you. It feels like it has control of you. The emotion is big and fast and hot a lot of times when we're triggered. And I think that dialing into when it's happening, I will venture to guess you will start seeing patterns in what is triggering you. And then I give people these questions that they can ask themselves. When I was interacting with this person, right, you realize, okay, so I was triggered by my boss. Then I call these the 3 cues for clarity, the 3 questions for clarity. You can ask, who does this person remind me of? You can ask, where have I felt like this before? You can ask, how or why is this behavioral dynamic, the way I'm interacting with my boss, how is that dynamic familiar to me? Because it might be one that you observed. Doesn't necessarily have to be one that you had yourself. You might have witnessed it with the adults in your life, and that could still trigger something in you. So understanding when you're having a transference is very important. I'll quickly tell anecdote because I feel, well, it's just a story, but I feel something that illustrates what it is could be helpful for the audience to understand. So I was in my internship when I was in grad school, and I was at a drug treatment clinic, and the boss there was this good looking tall Brooks Brother suit wearing, Wall Street Journal reading, golfing on the weekends, martini drinking kind of guy. So I would every week I'd go into therapy and talk about Dr. Washington, who was my boss there, what a friggin' jerk he was, and how cold and detached he was, and how I didn't like him. I didn't like him. My therapist was like, okay. So, but it was extreme. So my reaction to this guy was extreme. If I saw him coming down the hallway, I would literally dive into the ladies' room to avoid him. If he was in a meeting that I was in, I wouldn't say one word, which is very unlike me. I'm very talkative. And finally, the third week, I was obsessively talking about Dr. Washington as what a terrible human, what a mean and cold and judgmental human he was. She was like, Terry, can you describe him again? So I describe him. And she's, is there anyone else who you would describe like that? And of course, this guy was exactly like my father, down to having dimples and a very deep voice. There was so much resonance. I grew up afraid of my father. And so the 10-year-old in me was activated. I was triggered by this person who did nothing to me to trigger me. And she was like, Terry, so we started talking about it. And she's like, do you understand why this is bad for your career? She's like, this guy's never going to know how smart you are if you shut down every time you're around him because the 10-year-old is in charge. And I was like, oh, that's a really good point. Just having the realization that I was relating to my boss, like my 10-year-old self would relate to my father, literally took away my fear of this guy. Like I got it. It came from the basement, you're unconscious, to the main part of the house. And I was like, Dr. Washington's not my father and I'm not 10 and it's all fine. I got a job at that place after I graduate. There's something so powerful in recognizing when you're having that kind of a transference or when you're being activated from unresolved wounds from the past, which is basically what you're talking about. And then in therapy, we talked a little more because I was really surprised. I thought I had processed the crap out of my relationship with my father. I thought there was nothing left to process. But this guy reminded me in such a visceral way so much of him that I guess there was still stuff to process. And just that realization was so incredibly helpful.
Well, I think that's a great story and a great illustration. So thank you for sharing it.
Sure.
Well, you have been on a lot of podcasts. And as I was researching you, though, I ran across one that you did with Kathy Heller, one of my friends. And it was an awesome discussion, I thought, where she got very vulnerable herself about her own lack of boundaries. And for those of you who don't know her, Kathy has an amazing podcast called The Kathy Heller Show, probably over 1 million downloads a month, and also operates an incredible business. Where I'm going with this is we often see people like her and think that person has it all together. However, when she did this interview, she really was vulnerable about some huge boundary issues in her life, something that I think you refer to as boundary disaster. And I wanted to ask, maybe using that, what is a boundary disaster and why is it so hard for so many of us to stick to our boundaries?
Well, I personally was a boundary disaster. So that's basically where the phrase came from in my younger life, in my 20s. Why is it so hard? Because of the way that we are indoctrinated into a system. And this is men and women in particular, though. There's an expectation that little girls will be, where's my happy girl? Turn that frown around, right? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. This is the messaging that we got. Being nice as a little girl, we are taught that is more important than pretty much anything else. Others perceiving you as being nice. So we come from this deficit of boundaries because we learned the opposite is true. So you have, I have, we all have what I refer to as a downloaded boundary blueprint, which is a combination of the culture, the country you grew up in, the family system, because every family has their own norms and values and morals and all of that stuff and codes of behavior, right? This is how we do whatever the thing is. Family systems have their own identity, basically. And so most of us were taught that it's more important how other people feel than how we feel. As a woman, the more self-sacrificing, the better, right? You hear people described as, oh, she's amazing. You would love her. She would give anybody the shirt off her back. I'm always thinking, hey, man, keep your shirt on. Like, why being that self-abandoning and being praised, right? Most of us were raised and praised for being self-abandoning codependents. Like literally, that's what we were taught to be. So why it's so hard is that's why. Nobody taught us. And in fact, we were taught that if you had boundaries, you were selfish, self-absorbed. If you asserted yourself, you were, for women in particular, you're a bitch, you're hysterical, you're bossy, you're unfeminine, all the things. So we're coming from this place of vilifying having healthy boundaries, meaning that you're not the earth mother, self-sacrificing, amazing woman and mom that you should be if you have boundaries. So what I find with my therapy clients is that there's so much of that crap that we have to get through, really questioning what does it mean to have boundaries? So let's establish that quickly. Like what does it actually mean? I want you to think about your boundaries as your own personal rules of engagement. This lets people know what's okay with you and what's not okay with you. Your boundaries are comprised of your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, right? Because not all boundaries are the same. A preference is something that's negotiable, right? It's a preference. It's a nice to have. It's not a have to have. A deal breaker of a boundary, let's say in a relationship, maybe for me, since I'm in recovery, a deal breaker for me was I didn't want to be in a relationship with anyone else in recovery. And my friends in recovery were like, what's wrong with you? Are you judging people in recovery? I'm like, no, that's my personal deal breaker. There's only room for one recovering addict in a relationship that I'm in, and that's me. So, like, why are you judging me? Whatever your deal breakers are, you personally, your boundaries, your preferences, that's all unique to you. And you have every right to have them. And I think that we're so worried about what other people think about our boundaries, about our preferences, about our limits, setting a limit, simply saying no. People find very difficult, especially in my practice. So why we don't know is nobody told us. And they didn't teach us in school, and they didn't teach us in grad school, and they taught us nowhere. So you're literally talking about trying to be fluent in a language that nobody taught you. So that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be like, I'm really crossing my fingers, Terry. I want to wake up fluent in Mandarin tomorrow. You'd be like, I need a teacher. I need a course. I need a book. I need someone to help me learn this, which is why I wrote Boundary Boss. That is that manual for anyone, no matter where they are in their boundary journey. If they don't know what a boundary is, to someone who feels like their boundaries are pretty good, but maybe they want them to be better. Wherever you are is the perfect place to start to become fluent in the language of boundaries.
I want to go back to the beginning of the episode because the first few questions that we discussed were really about how do you find your true self? And I wanted to ask, what does it mean to have healthy boundaries? And how does that relate to embracing your true self?
Such a good question. Let's look at it this way. Disordered boundaries. So if your boundaries are too porous, that means they're too malleable, they're too loose, you're too impressionable, you're more like a chameleon or a peacekeeper. Or you can have boundaries that are too rigid. And then you're more of the, let's say, the ice queen, or like the loner, someone who you would rather cut people off than tell them how they hurt your feelings. So I think that people, first of all, don't understand what disordered boundaries are. They think that if you're a boundary boss, then you're telling everybody off and saying no all the time, and it's my way or the highway, buddy, which is not true. That's what someone with rigid boundaries would do. Healthy boundaries is in the middle of that, where there's a certain amount of flexibility that we have. So back to the question of how does this relate to your true self? When you have disordered boundaries, you're not being true to yourself. If I'm saying yes when I want to say no, to be nice, right? Under the umbrella, under the guise of being nice. Let's really think about that. Is that nice? Of course not. It's dishonest. It's really you wanting to avoid a confrontation. It's you being afraid of being rejected, right? There's all of these unconscious things that are driving our behavior. So it's not like we're nuts, like we're doing it for a reason. But here's the thing. If you're saying yes when you want to say no, if you don't correct someone that you're in a relationship with where they took you out to Mexican restaurant as a gift during the first 2 weeks of the relationship, and it's 15 years later, and you're still on every anniversary going out for Mexican, even though you don't like it, didn't like it then, don't like it now. Are you being nice? No. What you're doing, if you're saying yes when you want to say no, or not telling the truth about how you feel, the people in your life don't know you. So how can anyone authentically love you if you never allow them to authentically know you, because you're so caught up in people pleasing, or you're so caught up in not being rejected? You have so much fear of that. You're not honoring who you are. It's so sad. I've had women come into my therapy practice in their 6th, 7th decade of life being like, I've done it all. Kids all went to Ivy League schools, got money in the bank. I'm sitting on all these boards. I'm going to Soul Cycle 3 times a week. I still like my spouse. We do all this traveling, doing all this charity work. Why do I feel so empty? And I'm like, because you built your entire life based on checking boxes that somebody else has constructed, and literally nobody friggin' knows you. You feel empty because all of those accolades, and it's very, actually, this brings me back to what you were talking about in the beginning, John, about you're at the height of this massive, woo, fancy career, making all this dough. It's amazing. Life is great. I got all the stuff. And yet you were miserable because it wasn't your true heart's desire being fulfilled. Those things didn't fill that part of you that wanted meaning and the truth of what you're doing now. This is your authentic expression, right? This is you doing what only you can do in this world. And it's satisfying in a way that no Ferrari is going to be, or no beach house is going to be, doing this type of work. So it's very urgent. People figuring out their boundaries is urgent, because when you live a life of disordered boundaries, you are living a life that is not your own. You are not living authentically. You are not telling the truth about who you are. And it's a privilege to let the people in your life know who you are.
I love what you just said. And I think one of the most important lessons that I like to talk about is the power of saying no, because I think this is something, let's just look at an entrepreneur. And even since I started down this path of creating this podcast and the brand and everything else, it's as you're doing it, and then all of a sudden, all these temptations start hitting you from all sides. I'm sure you found that too. And one of the
Yep.
hardest things I've had to do along the way to stay focused is to say no to a lot of opportunities. Could they have been great? Maybe. But I knew where I wanted to go. And I knew if I started to invest any of my time in any of those other things, it was just going
Mhm.
to take away from what I was trying to do.
Right.
I recently interviewed Berkeley professor and author Dacher Kettler, who's one of the foremost experts in the world on emotions. Most people have come to believe that the emotion of awe comes from nature, spiritual practice, possibly art or music. However, in his new book, Awe, he did extensive research across 25 countries and came to the startling conclusion that more so than not, awe comes from moral beauty. When people see others display things like kindness and gratitude. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think this concept of moral beauty changes our relationship with the world and those who we
Mhm.
interact with?
Ah, I mean, it's fully aspirational. In saying moral beauty, it's basically talking about the way that we perceive other humans. What are the things that we dial into? Is it the good deeds? Is it the kindness, right? What are we seeking out? Are we valuing moral beauty? Because I got to tell you, I firmly believe personally, I am a moral beauty connoisseur of, I'm always seeking the online positive things. Who's doing random acts of kindness? And there are so many people doing it, because the bad news and the bad actors and the bad players get so much screen time everywhere. Even though I don't even watch the news, I read it. But so how does it impact us? It would change the world if this were something that we're taught, if this were something that were valued, not just by the people who are into moral beauty. Because what are we talking about? I mean, That's a phrase that he coined, I imagine. What are we really talking about? We're talking about human goodness, caring about our human family. It's not red, it's not blue, it's not this state, it's not that state. It's our human family, actually caring, feeling like you're a part of the whole. I feel like a citizen of planet Earth, me personally. Something that happens far away isn't not happening. It's not my concern. Do you know what I mean? Where I
Yeah.
feel like what's happening in the world is my concern. And it doesn't mean I fill my days with watching the news, because I don't. But I do work to find the good actors and the good players and to amplify those messages on my podcast and the things that I write about and the people that I associate myself with. Because I kid around and say that my desire is positive world domination, where the more we care about each other, the bigger ripple we will have in the world. And it's something that there's a lot of people who are dialed into this messaging, and so many people who are in my world and in my platform, they get it. They know that my desire is to lessen the suffering for as many people as possible and increase the joy. That's literally what I am doing on planet Earth. That's what I want to do by teaching people how to have these skills. But I think that we need so much more emphasis on moral beauty and that we're all connected. The divisiveness in the past 8 years has been so brutal. And that doesn't change what's true. Deepak would talk about meeting in the unified field. We're all connected. You can build as many walls as you want, a moat, you could have alligators. It does not change what is energetically true. It so behooves all of us to have each other's backs and to really care, especially about marginalized groups. Anyone in power needs to care about the people who are not in power.
No, and there was, I think, a great book that came out called The Good Life by Bob Waldinger, who's the current director of the Harvard Study of Adult Aging, that really addressed this in a great way. That
Mhm.
ultimately, what leads to living a good life are our relationships and human connections. And one of the reasons I think we're adrift, as Scott Galloway would like to say, is that I think technology is having a major ripple effect on culture and society. I mean, I am
Yeah.
really, really worried about the harm this is doing to dissolve human connections, especially in Gen Zers like my two kids. What are your thoughts about this, and how do you think we restore the joy of being connected to others?
I think we have to have boundaries with technology. That's the first thing. If you would want to have a conversation with me, I know you wouldn't, John, but let's just say you did, but you were looking down at your phone. I will just simply stop talking and I'll say, hey, I can wait if that's important. If someone says to me, no, I'm listening, I'm like, oh no, you need to listen with your eyes and your ears. If I can give you my full attention, you will definitely give me your full attention, or I will not have this conversation. There's something so dehumanizing about what has been going on with technology. Like, we are so distractible. Wow, what happened to our attention span? So I have a lot of like rules and regulations in my life around technology. I don't have a television in my bedroom, no phones in the bedroom. Bedroom is for sleeping and sex. That's it. This is what the bedroom is for. Meditating too, maybe. But I feel like within family systems, I love the idea of having a basket. People come into my house, there's a basket at the front door. And I'm like, put your phone in. Like, nobody is sitting here scrolling Instagram, people. We are together, especially when my family comes. I've got kids and grandkids. You could scroll Instagram on your own time. You don't need to do it here. So I think that some people will argue, especially during the pandemic, that there was connection that happened through our technology. And there's truth to that. But part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of limits on the technology. And what happens personality wise, what we see happens, you're behind a screen and you're on there, what people will say as they're trolling other people's stuff, they would never say in real life, right? They would never say that to your face. They would never have the courage or the disgust or the balls or whatever it is you'd want to say. So I always say it's like having cyber balls to a degree, like you're anonymous behind a screen. And that has tapped into the lowest inclinations of humans, this anonymity, because we haven't the social structure, right? Think about the 1950s, right? If you were dating your friend's sister, like you're going to see your friend again. You're not just ghosting Leslie, right? You got to break up with her. Like you actually have to do something because the social structure was such the construct that you'd be seeing these people again, right? Like you can't just disappear the way it is now. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the advancement in technology. And yes, many good things have come out of it, but I feel like we're still in the infancy. And so it's out of control. And I think that the pendulum is going to swing back the other way. But I feel like we must, again, take radical responsibility for our own use. What are we doing? How present are you with your children, people who have little kids now? Are you on your phone while you're supposed to be with your kid? That's damaging them. They know you're not there. They want your attention. So that's something that we have to build back to. But I see this. Anyway, I could keep going. I don't know what the answer is other than our own having control of ourselves.
Well, I'm laughing because sometimes I'll be scrolling through the phone and I'll look over and my dog is just staring at me like, what in the world are you doing? And why aren't you paying attention to me?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Terry, it's been great to have you on the show today. And I wanted to end with this question. For the listeners who are on the show, what would be the number one takeaway that you really want the audience to absorb?
How you feel, what you think, what you want matters. And by having healthier boundaries and learning to communicate, which you can do online, just go to YouTube, that will change your life. Like you matter. It's not you being a people pleaser is not pleasing anyone at the end of your life. You're not going to be happy that you did that. Your unique contribution can only come through you having healthy boundaries and knowing how to communicate effectively. And we need you. So 2 takeaways. One is you matter. And the second, I actually have a gift for your audience. So this is
Awesome.
about boundaries and codependency, because it's something that we didn't totally get into talking about, but we did on the sort of in a cursory way. It's so important. And people suffer from this and don't know. So anyway, this will help you figure out if you are codependent and give you ideas of things you can do. You can find that at boundaryboss.me/passionstruck.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. This was great.
Well, and Terry, I just wanted to highlight before we get off, you've got a
Sure.
great podcast yourself, one of the top 20 mental health podcasts out there. Will you just tell the audience a little bit about it? Because I
Sure.
think if they love my show, they'd love yours as well.
Yeah, I actually think we're actually very aligned with what we're doing. You'll have to come on my show too. I do 2 shows a week. One is solo, where I'm just talking about anything that I think will help your life is what I'm talking about on that solo show. A lot of my listeners write in and will ask me to cover topics, which I do. I love it. So that's one. And then the other is I interview people. So everyone from entertainment, from Leanne Rhymes to anybody, because especially the more high profile people who are really into mental wellness, but all the books that are out. So I interview lots of interesting people from different parts of life, but there's always a mental health angle to it because I'm always hoping you can learn something from my show that will increase your joy and decrease your suffering.
Well, I have a book coming out in about 8 or 9 months, so I will definitely take you up on it. So,
Excellent. I look
Terry,
forward.
well, thank you so much. It was such an honor. You've done so much for so many people. So I really appreciate you spending your time with my audience today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, John.